noting that the program director sent this from her personal Gmail account to their official email. The EPA has a history of using such methods to circumvent transparency. For instance, Gina McCarthy's been called before this committee or the Science Committee, I believe it's the Science Committee, for example, because of using her personal email for government business. This email that I've read today appears to me to be evidence of a deliberate intention to mislead. Going back to the fact that most employees try to do the best they can, and that a handful don't, I think that this indicates that there's a culture of secrecy and a lack of transparency that starts at the top. How would you respond to that?
I would respond by saying that EPA has a policy of not using personal email, and if there is an instance where it is necessary for technical reasons to copy one's government account.
Well, you know, she did that 6 weeks later. I've got a copy of the law here, Title 44, regarding federal records that requires that indicates, Mr. Chairman, that she didn't copy this in a timely manner. You know, I want to. This is not about finger pointing, and that's what troubles me about this hearing. It's not about politics. It's about these people who have suffered injury because of the failure of government. And I just want to say this. I believe every member of this committee has a responsibility to get to the truth, to make sure that government fulfills its responsibility to serve the public, and in this case, to protect the public. We want the truth. I've gotten to know a lot of the members on this committee, and I can assure you we can handle the truth, the whole truth. Mr. Chairman, I'm just not at all confident that we've heard the whole truth today. I yield back.
I think the gentleman will now recognize the gentlewoman from New Jersey, Ms. Watson-Coleman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to you and our ranking member for holding this hearing. This is indeed a sad day and a little bit confusing how we get to the bottom of something when everyone's pointing their finger in another direction, with the exception of Mayor Walling and Mr. Edwards. Mr. Edwards, I want to ask you a question that has nothing to do with Flint. My state, the state of New Jersey, is experiencing a knowledge of high lead content, particularly in 11 cities, but right now concentrating on one city. Do you know whether or not EPA is at all monitoring or getting involved in that situation at this early stage so that we won't have a Flint, Michigan situation?
My suspicion is that they're probably not, although they did send that memo, and again, I applaud this, that they sent the memo out that basically said, thou shalt stop cheating on the lead and copper rule monitoring. It took too long to get to that point, but that memo has gone out. It's not going to help you in the short term because it's going to take 6 months before those rules are changed.
Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Cummings, I believe that this issue is broader than what we're experiencing, this very sad situation, and I very much would look forward to having Oversight Committee hearing on EPA's role in this whole issue across the United States, because I think it will be very revealing and very, very scary what's happening in our small, older, poorer communities. And so I make that request for your consideration. Ms. Hedman, where is Mr. Del Toro?
Where is he?
Where is he?
Physically right now?
Working. Where is he working? Where is he located? Where is he working?
Well, he works out of the Region 5 office. I know that recently he has spent a great deal of time in Flint. So he may very well be there working right now.
So let me ask you this question. For 50 years, Flint, Michigan was receiving its water from the Detroit system. Is that correct? So for those 50 years, the water treatment system in Flint was dormant? Is that fair? Okay. Was there any requirement that before you reactivate a dormant system that you do certain precautionary testing and preparation?
I know that there are requirements, but I can't speak to the specifics.
Are there any EPA requirements?
Again, I can't speak to the specifics of that.
Dr. Edwards, can you answer that question?
The law requires that when you switch to a new water source, that you do corrosion control studies in advance of the switch to make sure that you have effective corrosion control in place. And in the absence of doing a study, the simplest thing, the minimum that would have been allowed under the law would have been to continue the corrosion control that was used in in Detroit water, which would have been dosing of orthophosphate. So had they done the minimum under the law, adding that orthophosphate to the Flint River water, which had been done for 50 years under Detroit, the vast majority of these problems, including the leaking pipes, the Legionella, the lead, would not have occurred.
So give me the time frame, because I'm confused somewhat about the time frame when this should have happened. Should that have happened in April of 2014?
This should have been done months before the switch.
The switch was April of 2014?
Yes.
And who was the emergency manager during that period of time?
I don't know at all.
Do you know, Mr. Early?
Yes, in April of 2014, I was the emergency manager.
So then why didn't you, as the emergency manager, ensure that before this switch was going to take place, that all of the safety and security measures were in place?
I did, and I was assured that all that were required had taken place. We had been monitoring this switch. Again, as I said, the project started before I got there, and once I got there, we continued to monitor, and I received updates from...
Well, Mr. Early, who told you? Who assured you that these safety and security measures were in place before actually turning on the switch?
The director of the Department of Public Works, which is also the director of the Flint Water Treatment Supply, or Water Treatment Department. It was his responsibility to make sure that all of those things were in place, and he had staff working with him, and they in turn worked directly with the MDEQ and the EPA to make sure we were meeting all of the requirements.
Okay.
Those were the requirements for getting the license.
Now we've introduced another level. The local sanitation department or water department manager.
The treatment people,
The
the water
treatment
plant.
people?
Yes.
So now it was his responsibility to ensure that these measures were in place, and he's the one that informed you that these measures were in place. He misrepresented?
That we were meeting the
Did he
requirements.
misrepresent? Did he tell you the truth?
Well, we all know now that the information that we all got was somewhat misinformed.
Where did the lie start?
Well, the information that we got was from the MDEQ, which governed our switch from the Detroit Water and Sewer Department to the Flint River. We relied on the information we received from the state regulatory agencies.
I can't believe my 5 minutes is up so quickly, because God knows we haven't gotten to the bottom of this yet. But thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back. This is incredibly
Thank the gentlewoman.
upsetting.
We'll now recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Hedman, I'm correct when I say that EPA has the authority to intervene when there's contamination in drinking water that poses a threat to humans. Is that correct? Yes.
When there is a threat and the state has failed.
When
to
there
take
is a
action.
threat to humans, EPA has the authority to intervene, correct?
And the state has failed to take action.
Now, come on, Ms. Hedman. EPA has a responsibility to the citizens. You have to intervene. Not when the state doesn't do it. When you see that it happens, you have to do it then. Isn't that, no, you don't. I'll ask the questions, okay? You're aware of the memo that came in June of 2015 from Miguel Del Toro, right? You're aware of that memo. In June of 2015, Mr. Del Toro's title was Regulations Manager, Groundwater and Drinking Water Branch. He's a drinking water specialist.
Yes.
In fact, I believe that he was one of the key members of your safe drinking water team.
Yes,
In fact, I believe that you've said he's one of the top experts in his field.
he is.
He is. Yet when Mr. Del Toro reported the high levels of lead in Flint's drinking water, not only did you silence him, but you sat around idly and did nothing. Why would you do that?
I didn't
If
do
if he is an expert, as you have acknowledged, why didn't you listen to him?
that. I did. And I did not sit silently. I did not.
I
fail
beg to
act.
differ, Ms. Hedman. Instead of heeding the warning of one of your top experts, one of your top experts. Listen, all of us here, we depend on people. We depend on staff. But if we don't listen to them, they do us no good whatsoever. You surround yourself with good people, as you did. You surrounded yourself with a specialist. You got to listen to them, but you didn't do that. Not only did you not listen to him, you tried to silence him.
I did not.
Now, you know, this is, so what did you do? You sought a legal opinion. Is that correct?
Well, immediately in June, I offered technical assistance to the Flint mayor. That was July 1st. On July 10th, we issued our first statement urging Flint residents to get their water tested and to take precautions to limit.
Here you have an expert who's telling you we got a problem. We got lead in our drinking water. Instead of protecting the citizens, like the EPA is, that's what EPA is about. Environmental protection, EPA, Environmental Protection Agency.
Yes,
protecting the public. Instead of saying, we've got an expert here, one of my team members who is an expert in this field is telling us we got lead in this water. Stop drinking it. Stop drinking it right now. But you didn't do that. You sought a legal opinion because you were wanting to follow the law?
No. Let's be clear. The data reported in Mr. Del Toro's memo was data related to one residence, first of all. My first question about that was, had the lead service line been removed? It was, and the follow-up testing showed that the water was safe to drink. And then two neighboring houses, one of which did show high lead levels and one of which did not. That data by itself indicated something about the tap water in those three residences. And ultimately, Mr. Del Toro's final version of the memo concluded that the residents with very high lead levels had high lead levels not due to lack of corrosion control, but because of physical disturbance of the lead surface line.
Because of physical disturbance of the lead surface line.
Construction in the street.
Construction in the street. You know,
and so the point being, his memo also made the point that corrosion control had not been implemented in Flint. That was a point that previously other members
Dr. Hedman, I'm sorry. Dr. Edwards, what do you make of this?
I'm kind of wondering if she's read the memo to this day, because there are 3 reports that the city had collected high lead in drinking water from Leanne's house, 100, 300, 700 parts per billion, before there was any disturbance. And moreover, her statement that she warned Flint residents to start flushing the water, no Flint residents got a warning that the water was unsafe to drink. What they got is Mr. Walling going on TV and saying that the water is safe to drink. That was the message that was sent. No Flint resident got any warning about dangerous levels of lead in drinking water, the fact that corrosion control laws were not being followed in Flint. No one knew that.
You know, let me tell you, Dr. Hedman, I'm sorry. There's a special place in hell for actions like this. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Gentleman yields back. Recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Liu, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to start with the national issues and then come down to Flint. We know that in addition to Flint, we've had lead-tainted water in Washington, D.C., in Sebring, Ohio, and now in Newark, New Jersey, where school children have been poisoned. Ms. Hedman, this really is a national issue as well, isn't it?
Given that I'm no longer at the agency, I don't want to speak for EPA, but indeed, lead is an issue of concern throughout the country.
I have 2 articles here. One is a report from the NRDC that says, study finds safety drinking water in U.S. cities at risk. NRDC reports on drinking water systems of 19 cities and finds that pollution, old pipes, and outdated treatment threaten tap water quality. And then I have a second article in Salon. It says it's not just a Flint problem. Other U.S. cities are suffering from toxic water. And Mr. Chairman, if I could enter these into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Ms. Hedman, I'm going to read you a couple of sentences from this Salon article. The author writes, the Safe Drinking Water Act, enacted in 1986, required the EPA to set standards for the concentration of lead in public pipes with a push for lead-free. This stirred the country on the road towards replacing old water pipes with plastic pipes as an eco-friendly alternative. However, many poor municipalities instead turned to anti-corrosive agents as a cheaper and faster solution. If Flint had plastic pipes, none of us would be here today, correct?
That's true.
In fact, if Sebring, Newark, and Washington, D.C. had plastic pipes, none of that lead contamination would have happened, correct?
That's true, although if there were lead in fixtures, it would still be a concern.
I understand. Thank you. Now let's talk about Flint. Mr. Early, I read your testimony, and I heard it today as well. You essentially say everything was fine, and everyone told you everything was fine, and you had regular meetings with the water treatment officials. Did you know that the water treatment plant operator, Michael Glasgow, wrote an email saying, I have people above me making plans to distribute water ASAP. If water is distributed from this plant in the next couple of weeks, it will be against my direction. So it was not fine for Michael Glasgow. Were you aware of that?
I'm
It's
sorry.
Mr. Early, yes.
Oh.
I was made aware of that email when I sat before the governor's task force. It was the first time I had seen that email. So I'm not sure what he's referring to when he talks about people above him, because there were at least two other layers, possibly two other layers of supervision before it got to me.
So even though you regularly, as you said, regularly met with water treatment plant officials, you had no idea that the water treatment plant operator has said, I am not ready to go on this. You had no idea.
No, there was no discussion on that in our regular meetings. What was going on?
Stop right there. You also testified that this was not a leadership issue. This is purely a water treatment issue. I suggest that this was a leadership issue if you had no idea, even though you had regular meetings, that this water treatment plant operator was making these statements that he was not ready to go. I'm curious. You know, Mr. Walling, I commend him for saying I'm sorry and for apologizing. That took courage. Mr. Early, I don't see that anywhere in your testimony. Are you ready to say you're sorry?
What I've said and will say again is that, you know, I was responsible. It happened on my watch.
Are you sorry?
I feel very badly about that. And yes, I'm sorry that the people of the city of Flint have had to go through, I said that earlier, this crisis. It tears me up inside. I'm very regretful and remorseful for what's happened.
Ms. Hedman, the EPA knew in April that corrosive agents were not being put in. Why did it take so long for them to let you know in end of June that that was not happening?
I think from the review of the emails that I have seen during that time period, that the first reaction was, if we simply tell MDEQ they need to do this, they'll do it.
When were corrosive agents actually put in?
December 9th is when corrosion control began.
So April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, children in Flint were drinking lead-contaminated water. Why in July or August didn't you just stand up and yell and scream, stop this, stop, give them bottled water? Why did it take so long? I mean, to me, this is negligence bordering on deliberate indifference. You knew, EPA knew in April, corrosive agents not done. In June, you were notified of that. And then you were given a report that said, lots of lead in this drinking water. And then nothing is done until December. There is no excuse for that. Someone needed to have yelled and screamed and said, stop this. People are being poisoned. Should have been done in at least July or August, maybe September, at least by October. That was so wrong. This was a crime of epic proportions that could have been prevented. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Now recognize the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Mulvaney, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman. I thank the committee. I'll try and, I guess, start as simply as I know how, which is Dr. Edwards, I think at the end of Mr. Carter's testimony, asked a question of Ms. Hedman, and I'll go ahead and ask it. He asked, did you warn Flint residents to flush their water?
On July 10th, 10 days after I first learned about this, EPA Region 5 issued the first statement advising Flint residents to get their water tested by their water utility and referring them to EPA information on the web about limiting exposure to lead in drinking water.
So is that your testimony when you said you gave them warning to flush their water? That's what you're referring to?
Right, that was the first time that we did that,
Okay, that was in July.
July 10th.
I'm looking at an email that's been mentioned a couple times, and to the extent it's not been entered in the record, Mr. Chairman, it's an email of Miguel Del Toro dated September 22nd, 2015. I asked it to be added to the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
And I'm sitting here, are you familiar with this email, Ms. Hedman?
I'm not sure what the email is.
It begins, it's to Thomas Ploy, Rita Baer, Nicholas D'Amato, Joanna Glowacki, and Andrea Porter, amongst others, from Miguel Del Toro, September 22nd, 2015. Begins, this is no surprise, lead lines plus no treatment equals high lead in water equals lead poisoned children. You familiar with that email?
Only hearing it from you.
Okay. If you read down the email, by the way, I think the email is an email that you sent, Mr. Edwards, that was then forwarded. I'll get to that in a second, I hope. It says, even worse, absent anything from EPA, MDEQ, and the city other than they are in full compliance. Other folks have to alert the public to the risk. Do you get the impression from the email that Mr. Del Toro thinks that the EPA warned the folks in Flint in September to flush their water?
We had been told on August 31st by MDEQ that the Michigan, it was MCH, the old acronym for the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, was in fact implementing a public information campaign. On September 15th, I held calls with both the mayor and with the director of MDEQ, urging expedited implementation of corrosion control and expanded public information campaigns. And the mayor and the county did issue a health advisory with that kind of information 10 days later.
All right. I wish I could go into every single one of those. I know Dr. Edwards is probably eager to do that, but I'm going to, you said something earlier today, which I think took a lot of us off guard, surprised a lot of people sitting here, when you said you didn't think the EPA had done anything wrong through this entire process. And my guess is if I asked you for evidence of that, you would lay out what you just laid out. We did this on this date, this on this date. Let me ask you this. Is that the standard to which you held yourself at the EPA? Just not to do anything wrong?
No.
What was the standard to which you held yourself when you were at the EPA?
To do the best job possible.
Did you do the best job possible?
In retrospect, knowing what I know now, I wish we had issued more frequent and more urgent statements.
But it's still your belief and your testimony that you didn't do anything, that the EPA and you didn't do anything wrong in handling the Flint situation.
As I said, I wish we had done more. I wish when MDEQ represented facts to us, we had verified those
Let me
facts.
ask you about that, because there's another thing you said today that, again, caught me a little bit off guard. It says the EPA, yes, in answer to questions from someone, I apologize for getting who, is supposed to step in to protect safety, but only if there is a threat, which clearly there was, and the state has failed to act. Do you remember that testimony?
Yes.
Is it your testimony then that the state had not failed to act?
At which point in time?
At any point in time. I pick one. I don't care. September, by Mr. Del Toro's email of September 22nd, had the state failed to act by that time?
By that time, the state had issued an order to Flint directing Flint to implement corrosion control, and the mayor had announced that he was going to take that action.
My question is, had the state failed to act?
The state had taken some actions, and let me...
Not the standard. You said the EPA isn't really supposed to get involved unless there's a threat, number one, and the state has failed to act, number two. So I'm asking you, as of September, had the state failed to act?
We were involved, and the legal advice that I received at that time...
Okay, you were involved, but people were still drinking lead-contaminated water. How is that possible?
We were involved in that there are two things that we tried every day to make happen. One is implementation of corrosion control, and two is a public information campaign to make sure that Flint residents knew what they needed to do to reduce risks until corrosion control worked.
I'm not going to have nearly enough time to do any of this. I do want to ask Dr. Edwards one question before he left. You said something, sir, earlier that interested me as well, which is you said that in a different environment, this would be criminal. What did you mean when you said that? I apologize if that's not the exact words, but you did use the words criminal.
I think in any environment, it's criminal when you know children are being harmed and not being protected by federal law, and you sit there silent.
And if
I will point out, Virginia Tech issued the first warning to not drink the water in August 2015. MDEQ invoked the authority of EPA in its response to the press, to our warning about the dangers of Flint water, to say the water was safe to drink. EPA sat there silent at a minimum as the state attacked us for saying Flint water was not safe to drink.
If I had done this as a terrorist to the children of Flint and I got caught, would I be in jail?
I've already said if a landlord did this, he would be in jail.
Or a builder, a home builder, which is what I used to do. If I built a house that poisoned my residents the same way the city of Flint has done it, I'd be in jail, wouldn't I? Which leads to my last question. Mrs. Hedman, should the government be held to a different standard than its citizens?
Everyone should be required to follow the law.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We'll now recognize the gentlewoman from the Virgin Islands, Ms. Plaskett, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, witnesses, thank you for being here this morning. Mr. Early, on February 2nd, the Governor of Michigan, Rick Schneider, issued a statement informing the public of your resignation that was going to be effective on February 29th. Have you seen that press release?
Yes.
Okay. And in it states, and I'm going to quote here, Governor Schneider and I agreed that our goal was for me to be the last emergency manager appointed to DPS. I have completed the comprehensive restructuring necessary to downsizing the central office. That's your quote, correct?
That is.
And do you remember giving the quote to the governor for the press release for that?
Excuse me?
Do you remember giving the governor that quote for his press release?
Yes, I remember, not directly to him, but I discussed it with his communications people, yes.
Okay, and that press release and your resignation came a day before, less than 24 hours before this committee was having a hearing on Flint, Michigan on February 3rd. The Chairman Chaffetz and Ranking Member Cummings sent a letter in January for you to testify at that time, but you refused to come. When you were giving the quote to the governor's office for the press release the day before the hearing took place, did you have a conversation with the governor or with those individuals in his office about testifying before this committee?
No, my conversations regarding the letter that you referred to took place before that. They were only drafted on the 1st of February because we had pretty much done all in Detroit Public Schools as an emergency manager that I would be able to do.
So you discussed with him around February 1st your resignation on February 2nd and what the quote was going to be, but you knew that you had a pending request to testify before this committee at that time. Isn't that correct?
The exact...
Did you know that you had to testify, that there was a request for you to testify on February 3rd when you were having discussions with the governor and his staff about your resignation on February 1st or 2nd?
We had that discussion prior to the 2nd.
You just said the 1st.
Well,
so,
the 1st. The discussion, the press release came out after
the press release came out on February 2nd, less than 24 hours before this hearing. Okay. In your discussions with the governor about that press release, did you discuss with him your request, the request for you to testify before this committee?
It had nothing to do with the
it's a yes or no. Yes or no. Did you discuss it with him?
Yes.
You did discuss testifying before this committee?
I did discuss that I had received the invitation, yes.
And what was said during that discussion?
That I had received an invitation.
And the governor, did he direct you to comply with that?
No.
And you did not at that time. So clearly, you had a discussion with the governor, a governor who has said he wants transparent and accountability for the individuals that are working, and you worked for the pleasure of the governor. He did not direct you to testify when the request had been made by the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform about this. So on February 2nd, when Chairman Chaffetz's staff informed your lawyer that the chairman was considering issuing a subpoena to compel you to testify before the committee on that day. Did you discuss that with the governor?
No, I had that discussion with the attorney because I had to seek out some advice as to how to respond to the initial invite, because I did not have time to prepare for a hearing, was more than willing and certainly wanted to come forward and discuss the facts of this. That had nothing to do with my appointment at Detroit Public Schools.
But your appointment was made by this same governor, and you had it within you to discuss it with him, and you were serving at his direction. And even though that discussion had taken place, your attorney that you says you sought out about the subpoena, you told the attorney and asked him to refuse to accept the service of the chairman's subpoena because you said you didn't have time to coordinate your testimony, but you had time to coordinate on October 26th your op-ed in which you said don't blame the emergency manager for the Flint water disaster and outlined reasons why that was your position at that time.
No, I did not discuss the subpoena in terms of not coming to this hearing. That was never a discussion that I had. I sought counsel because I wanted to understand the process. The invitation was what I said that I was not prepared to attend, not the subpoena.
So you didn't tell your attorney to refuse service of the subpoena?
No.
That was potentially being?
No.
Okay. That's important for us to note for the record. We have an email that says that you were being told that a subpoena was going to be issued to you at that time. You're aware of that?
I don't recall.
We have the email, Mr. Early.
Okay,
You want me to put it on the screen?
No. Yes, if you would, please.
Okay, could we do that? And at that time, while they're putting that up, that email exchange with your attorney, so now you're saying that the attorney didn't tell you that you were supposed to potentially be subpoenaed to testify before this committee?
I sought advice of counsel on the issue regarding the invitation, and then declined the invitation because I didn't have an opportunity to prepare.
I've moved on from the invitation. I'm now talking about the subpoena.
Okay.
Did you have a discussion with your attorney about service and acceptance of the subpoena, potential subpoena?
That's an attorney-client issue that I would like to refer to my attorney to answer if it's that possible.
I'm glad he's not a plotted plant in this one, and he's going to give you some advice about that. That was very good. So did you inform the governor that you were going to refuse to testify even after a potential subpoena was going to be issued?
No, I did not.
And did the governor ever instruct you to cooperate with this committee? And did they encourage you to comply with the request when it was an invitation?
No, it was strictly my decision based on my conversation with my counsel about preparation for a very important hearing, and that was pretty much the extent of it.
And so the governor didn't tell you yes or no whether he thought it was a good reason that you should or should not testify?
The governor did not advise me on that because I sought legal advice on that.
No. We went by earlier in your testimony. You said that you let the governor know that you had an invitation to testify. Did he respond to that particular comment that you made to him?
I think the response was, as I recall it, was, it's your decision, do what you have to do what you feel most comfortable doing.
Do we have the email? No? Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. And actually, Mr. Chairman, I know it's unusual, but the gentlewoman from Michigan wanted me to yield time to her, but, in getting a witness to actually answer a question, it was a little difficult. Would you give us the indulgence of allowing her?
We will be, by under House rules, you can do a second round, but we need to go through everybody first.
Okay, thank you, sir.
So we're going to actually now recognize the gentlewoman from New Mexico, Ms. Lujan Grisham.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Then I'll be happy to provide a minute to my colleague, Ms. Lawrence, and yield to her.
Thank you. I have a question for each of them. Mr. Edwards, in your communications on this issue, do you feel the governor knew what was happening?
I haven't seen emails that showed that he knew about.
Do you feel he should have known?
I feel that the governor should have listened more to the people of Flint and been less trusting of EPA and MDQ.
Mr. Walding, in your role, would the governor or should the governor have known, or are you aware that he knew? You said you contacted his office. Did he know?
He knew of the issues we had in January of 2015 because we did have a follow-up phone call. From the emails that I've seen, it appears that all of his senior aides were aware of extensive issues with DEQ and DHHS.
Mr. Early, you were his direct appointee. Did you communicate with the governor? Was the governor aware of this water situation in Flint?
The situation that I communicated to the governor involved, as I've said, the contamination issues that we were trying to manage when I was there. I had no discussions with the governor regarding lead corrosion or lead contamination.
But you communicated with him that there was a water issue in the city of Flint?
Yes, from the switch.
Ms. Heidemann, did you communicate directly with the governor's staff, the governor, to inform him of the situation that was happening with EPA and the water situation in Flint?
My only communication with the governor's staff occurred in the days leading up to the announcement of the Flint Action Plan, which I think occurred on October 2nd.
Thank you. I yield back the rest of my time.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. So I'm going to try to dig a little deeper in that context, because what we all want is good and effective government. And for me, it's irrelevant whether that good and effective protective government is at the federal level, at the state level, or the local level. It should all be working to serve and protect its citizens. And Ms. Hedman, I appreciate your recognition that you could have been more vigorous, but in the context of it's the state's primary responsibility, and that when a state fails, as was the case in Michigan, we have a terrible end result. We have people drinking unsafe water. And I think people want to know if the state of Michigan's failures are typical of other state governments, which is really going to it should cause all of Congress to think about the role of federal government, EPA, and what we do about state accountability in this regard. Now, Ms. Hedman, in a footnote in your written testimony, you mentioned a drinking water crisis that occurred in Toledo, Ohio in 2014. Was the danger to human health in that crisis? Was there danger?
There was. It was the toxin microcystin.
And how long did it take the mayor of Toledo, based on that message from you, to issue a do not drink notice?
He immediately issued a do not drink.
So he immediately reacts. Did the Ohio EPA resist the sampling protocol EPA was recommending, as MDEQ did in the case of Flint?
No, not at all. They took on board all the sampling advice and worked very closely with our Cincinnati lab to
And in
test the
fact,
water.
in your written testimony, you commend Governor Kasich for his handling of that particular crisis. In fact, you note that he called on the National Guard immediately.
Immediately, Governor Kasich said he would call off the National Guard to deliver bottled water, and he did it.
So I take it that you believe that there's a serious critical difference between the response of Governor Snyder and the response of Governor Kasich.
Yes.
In our investigation of the Michigan crisis, the committee received startling testimony from the former head of the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality. He told us that the topic of the Flint water crisis never even made it to the agenda of Governor Snyder's cabinet meetings. Never, not once. In your experience working with Ohio, did Governor Kasich make Toledo's drinking water a priority of his entire administration?
Well, I can tell you that he not only responded quickly in terms of calling out the National Guard to get the water out, after the entire scenario had ended, I believe that he actually reached out and thanked
So we can see a stark and dramatic difference between the responsibility of these two states. And I think it's the job of this committee to make sure that the federal government, the state government, and the local government are doing all it can and should and is required to do to protect its citizens. Correct?
I agree.
Thank you. So one last thing. I'm about out of time. But quite frankly, given this testimony, if Governor Snyder had reacted to the Flint water crisis In the same way in which Governor Kasich reacted to the Toledo water crisis, do you believe it would have made a significant difference to human health and safety in regards to the drinking water situation in Flint, Michigan?
I do.
Thank you. No, I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. I have a few more questions I'd like to go through. Ms. Hedman, you have cited repeatedly how urgent it was and how important it is. We spent, over the course of 3 days, a transcribed interview with Mr. Dan Wyant. Do you know who he is?
Yes, he was the director of MDEQ.
When did you have the first conversation with him about the concerns of what's going on in Flint, Michigan?
I know from checking my records that I definitely had a conversation with him on September 15th, right before I had a conversation with the mayor. I believe I also had a shorter conversation with him on September 1st as part of a commissioners roundtable.
At least according to Mr. Wyant, and it's a little while ago, his first conversation with you was September 27th. Now, whether it's the 15th or the 27th, can you see the concern that it took that long before you actually talked to the person who's in charge of the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality? What the heck are you doing if you're not calling him?
So again, I believe I also talked with him on the 1st. But
Okay,
the point,
September 1st.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and give you a little latitude there. I don't believe you because I don't see any reason to trust you. But let's assume that that's true for a second. Why did it take so long?
my staff was reporting that
So it was your
Michigan-
staff's fault?
No. That Michigan was taking the required action, that Michigan was reporting that there was going to be a public information campaign. And if Michigan staff had said, we will not issue the order that EPA has requested, then I would have gone directly to the director.
But they didn't, did they?
They did on August 17th.
So this is the fundamental problem with government and big government. It's, oh, well, we'll delegate this, and we'll have it. Instead of just picking up the phone and talking to somebody and having a discussion with them. They have these emails here, for instance. This one is dated October 1st, where he was led to believe that you actually supported what they were doing. And this is the communication back and forth that Mr. Edwards talks about, where they're led to believe that they are actually in compliance. In fact, it's later on, even in November, when the EPA admits that the lead and copper rule is ambiguous. It's just, there's not clarity there. They admit that. It's your own internal email. Mr. Edwards, can you comment on this? And you've been so good at giving a perspective on all this, but for those that don't know how to read these reports, what's your analysis of that?
Well, I think that EPA was embarrassed by how long it took them to actually act, that it became a national and international embarrassment by that point, and then what are they going to do? Say that they knew there was no confusion right from the start? When I read that memo, it was essentially a get-out-of-jail-free card for both EPA and MDEQ. We don't understand our own law, is essentially what that memo said. So I just thought it was absurd.
Ms. Hedman, are you familiar with we had a hearing here in July of last year about you and your region. Are you familiar with that?
I did hear about it. I was actually visiting some Indian tribes in northern Minnesota when that occurred.
So did you get a follow-up? Did you read about it? Tell me what you know about that.
I did, and I was very, very concerned about some of the allegations that were made. And let me say, as someone who has been an intern here on Capitol Hill in the 1970s, and someone who early in my career experienced both sexual harassment and sexual discrimination, I have zero tolerance for that in the workplace.
Then why did we have 3 of your employees do a very brave and courageous thing and step forward and testify to Congress that you tried to retaliate against them for talking about this, that some of them were asked to remove the investigators? I mean, it's one thing when I get one person, but when we get 3 people testifying before Congress, putting their lives and their livelihood and their careers on the line, There's some smoke there, isn't there? Are you telling me you did nothing wrong?
I can tell you that I asked for follow-up to look into those allegations, and
What was the conclusion?
at no point did anyone ever present any evidence that those allegations were in fact true.
We sat here for a couple hours and heard testimony. There's some evidence there. I just wish you were at the EPA so I could call on you to be fired, because you should have never been in this position. It's so frustrating. And this is what happens. 99% of the people, good federal employees, they're patriotic, they're hard working, they do the right thing. And then we get somebody who comes along, who spoils it, they're bad apples, and they just say, oh, I'll just retire. Full benefits, full everything. That was absolutely, fundamentally, totally wrong.
Mr. Chairman, I do want you to know that I appointed a new assistant regional administrator who has aggressively dealt with these kinds of situations. And I personally recall a case where we removed someone for sexual harassment and another case, which the Inspector General gave us very high marks for, where we removed an individual who viewed child pornography on a federal computer, and he is in federal prison.
Well, and there are ongoing investigations right now by the Inspector General, and this should have been dealt with at a much higher level. Let me go on to Mr. Walling. I need to help, Mayor, for some clarification. You became the mayor in 2009 in a special election, reelected in 2011. But I honestly don't know what this means, but I want to understand. In your bio, you were the chairman of the Karangandi Water Authority from 2010 to 2015. Were you paid or compensated in any way, shape, or form for being the chairman of the KWA?
I was not. I served as a function of being mayor. The mayor of a incorporating community in that authority serves, as does the current mayor, serves in that role now.
So when you become the mayor, you then get to be the head of that. And this, because one of the concerns is, are there conflicts of interest? Because essentially the KWA gets $200 million or so to start building this pipeline. And that puts you in a pretty powerful position to direct dollars and locations and knowledge ahead of time. It gives you essentially insider information, does it not?
It is a major project. It is a major responsibility. The chairmanship came to me through an election of the members of that authority. That happens on an annual basis. The officers of that authority are elected.
Are you here to testify again? I just want to be clear. I don't want to disparage you unfairly in any way, shape, or form, but I need to know from you personally here, did you benefit personally in any way, shape, or form from that assignment and that knowledge?
No, I did not, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Mr. Edwards, tell me what DEQ, in your opinion, the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, what did they do right and what did they do wrong? Did they do anything right?
No. Honestly, as I sit here, I can't think of a single thing they did right.
Did the EPA do anything right?
Mr. Del Toro did everything every EPA employee should aspire to do. His memo could have made EPA the heroes here in this particular case, even despite the 10 years of allowing utilities to cheat on the lead and copper rule prior to that time. He realized the danger that put in Flint's children in.
And what's your personal assessment of what the governor has done or is doing now?
Well, unlike EPA, the governor has taken responsibility for what occurred. Certainly he was guilty of not listening to Flint residents. Certainly he was guilty of being overly trusting of MDQ and EPA. But at present, he says that he wants to be part of the solution, and he's actively engaged in this. And so I'm willing to work with anyone who wants to be part of the solution, and I think he's sincere about trying to help Flint get back on its feet.
We are about to have a vote called on the floor. Let me, if the ranking member has another, yes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Early, I'm still a little stunned by what you told Representative Plaskett. You said that you talked to the governor's office about our request for you to testify on February 3rd, and by the way, that was a joint request, Democrats and Republicans. And you said that they never directed you, the governor never directed you to cooperate with us, the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform, and that they just told you to do whatever you had to do. Is that right?
Well, basically it was, to make my own decision about going. And because it was, as I said, an invitation, and I was not prepared to sit before this committee, I declined the invitation. And that was the extent of the conversation I had with the governor. But the subpoena that you're referring to, or that has been referred to, was issued a night before. I could not have gotten here physically to do that. And it was never served on me. So my announcement, basically that, I was declining the invitation was in hopes that I could have enough time to prepare and to get here and to meet with this committee.
Now, you had said that you had some discussions, that you had discussions with the governor. Did you have discussions with Mr. Muchmore? Do you know who he is?
Yes, I know Mr. Muchmore.
And did you have discussions with him about what was going on in Flint with regard to the water?
Not specifically. He was a part of some of the meetings that we had as we were briefing them on the progress. But again, this was all on the contamination issues prior to the lead leaching issues that we now deal with. But they were apprised of the progress we were making in converting from DWSD to the use of the Flint River during the interim while the KWA was being completed. Yes, we had those discussions.
Okay. Did it surprise you that Mr. Wyan had told us that it was never brought up in the governor's cabinet meetings?
That is a surprise.
And why did you say that?
Well,
this was a major thing, right? I mean, this was not...
Yes,
yeah.
yes, that is a surprise. I was not a part of the governor's cabinet.
I understand that.
Yeah. So I didn't know what was being discussed in those meetings, and I can only take that as, a comment from a former employee.
Mr. Walling, do you have discussions with Mr. Muchmore?
I did on a few occasions, a phone call.
And was he aware of what was going on, in
Yes.
Flint with regard to the water?
Yes.
And so is it fair to say that you would have had more conversations with him than you would have had with the governor?
Yes, I did. I would call the chief of staff, and also one of his direct reports, Harvey Hollins, who is his urban initiatives director, was in regular communication with us, even as elected officials during the emergency manager.
One of the things that we concluded is that the governor probably did not do a lot of communicating in writing with regard to this event and this whole water thing and crisis. And what we were trying to do was therefore, in order for us to get the kind of information we needed, we needed to talk to folks. And that's the 15 people we were trying to get to, including Mr. Muchmore and I think the other gentleman you just mentioned. And again, they refused to talk to us. So hopefully they'll have a change of heart. I yield back.
Thank you. We'll recognize Ms. Plaskett for a moment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We were concerned about this email, and I do have the redacted version for you and for your attorney. If you would like at some point to have a look at this, and you may want to make an amendment to your testimony after such a review, the chairman and the staff can make this available for the both of you.
We'll allow 72 hours for such clarification.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have a vote on the floor. I want to thank the four of you for your time. This is very illuminating. Again, our hearts and prayers and thoughts go to the people who actually live in Flint, who are affected by this and are going to continue to be affected by this. We look forward to the part 3 of our hearing with the Governor Snyder as well as the EPA Administrator. And that will take place in this room on Thursday at 9 a.m. We stand adjourned. I want to get through the hearing on Thursday before we make any recommendations or support any legislation. Other members might, but at least for me personally. All right.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Fire away. We got about 2 minutes before I got to leave to get to a vote. So,
Chairman Chapman, do you feel that this hearing has revealed any new revelations, or was this sort of, again, shifting blame from those who could be responsible?
We better darn well understand where we've been in order to fix it going forward. So a lot of finger pointing, but we need actual solutions. So